In our book we have, our book is called The Dream of Scipio. Why is it called The Dream of Scipio? Where does it get this title from? But the painting was also named after something earlier, wasn't it? Right? The Raphael painting. Cicero's work, The Dream of Scipio, but also within here, Manlius's text called The Dream of Scipio as well. Right? So we do have those 3 points of references. Yes, we've seen the Raphael painting, The Dream of Scipio, which is on the front of our syllabus, but that painting takes its name from the Roman author, philosopher, politician, orator, rhetorician, all-round smart guy, Cicero, right? Whose work was called The Dream of Scipio. Remember, Cicero in his time is witnessing the end of the Roman Republic and the move into the Roman Empire, right? Which eventually actually leads to his rather nasty end. He gets killed for political reasons. But remember, his Dream of Scipio looks back to the golden days of the Roman Republic, right? When they had people like Scipio and his adopted grandfather, Scipio Africanus, who appears in that dialogue, right? Now, of course, as we mentioned, we also have Manlius's fictional, right? This doesn't actually exist historically because Manlius is a made-up character, right? But his version of The Dream of Scipio, which is his own imagined dialogue, his own sort of essay dialogue that he has produced, called The Dream of Scipio. And we don't actually get to read The Dream of Scipio in here, right? Instead, as in today's reading, we get to see the narrator's sort of summary or report of some of the things, the key ideas that we see from The Dream of Scipio that is Manlius's version, right? So we don't just get to sit and read like the pages of what Manlius actually says, but we do get to see, beginning with today, some of the things that Manlius actually says and what he actually argues, and even some quotations from that imaginary document, The Dream of Scipio. All right. So in that Dream of Scipio, what we're also going to see, and this is going to be important for some of the things I want to say today, is that notice the way in which our novel is often structured is that we often learn about the end of events, right? We learn what has happened, right? So we know, for example, our most obvious example of this is the first sentence of the book, in which we find out that Julian kills himself by setting himself on fire. Right? So our question then throughout the book, we know what happens to Julian, we know from the very first sentence, but then our question is why? Why did things turn out this way? Right? We're starting also to see in our reading for today that there are certain things that we learned about the end of, or not the end of, but what happens with Olivier, right? We learn in today's reading, for example, that he betrays Cicciani. Cicciani fails in his political moves that we've seen him making to try and bring the papacy from Avignon back to Rome, right? So we learn about some of those important details, but we still don't know why and exactly what happened with Olivier and why he would betray Cicciani or why he would do all of these sorts of things. And similarly, we don't know what happens with Manlius and what decisions that he makes. And so one of the things that's important when we're thinking about this fictional document of The Dream of Scipio, right, the one that Manlius wrote, is that I want you to keep on thinking as we're reading about this when he writes it, right? Because we know that he's going to make some tough, difficult choices, right? So we want to think about, it matters if he wrote this document, this Dream of Scipio, before he makes those choices, and then he uses the ideas in the Dream of Scipio to guide him. Or, as our reading today seems to suggest, did he make his decisions and then he writes the dream of Scipio afterwards to justify the things that he did? All right? So as you go on to the next parts and you see what Manlius does and the decisions that he makes, right? And of course also Olivier as well, since we don't know what exactly he's going to do. We already have some ideas about Julien, but we don't quite know fully his story yet either. So as these gaps in our knowledge are filled in, right? Think about like the way in which Ian Pears uses time. Sometimes he jumps forward in time. We already know what happens to some extent to some of the things that are going to happen later on. We know Ciccani fails, Olivier betrays him. We know that Julien is going to die. Right? But the meaning of those things, right? Why they happen, how we view them, how we judge them, how we think about them, right? Those are still left for us to think about and to decide. And as I said, I want you particularly to think about the timing of the writing, Manlius's writing of the Dream of Scipio. Does he write it before and he uses the ideas to guide him, or does he write it afterwards to justify what he did? Okay. So as I've done before, here's a brief synopsis overview of what happens in our reading for today. Right. First of all, Marshal Pétain, remember I mentioned that he's a real-life figure, right? He was a hero, French hero in World War I in fighting off the Germans, and he becomes the leader of the sort of the free France, the unoccupied parts of France, which is the sort of the southern part of France during the early parts of the war, and he's the leader of the Vichy regime, and he loses a lot of historical credibility. First of all, he is a hero in World War I, and then he becomes a villain because of his collaboration with the Germans in World War II. So in our story, Marshal Pétain comes down to Avignon. He meets with Marcel. He likes what he's doing. So Marcel feels like he's really achieved something, and he's on the way up. And then we see less than a month later, after Marshal Pétain has come down there, the Nazis, they finally take over the rest of France, right? I think I mentioned this to you before. Right? They didn't, when they invaded France, they didn't invade all of France at once, right? They sort of invaded the top half, occupied Paris and other places like that. And so the bottom part was known as free France, right? And so we see Julien has been living in free France, Marcel has been living in free France, but really not so free. Right? Not so free. So the Nazis finally occupy all of France, and when they come, they are, just like Marshal Pétain was, they are impressed by what Marcel has been doing. His lists of Jews and collaborators and troublemakers and communists and so on. Like, oh, this guy, yeah, we like what he's doing. So we then see Julien. He starts writing an essay on Olivier that we're told is left unfinished. He never completes it. And the theme of the essay is about loyalty, right? Remembering that Julien himself is struggling with this question of loyalty, right? Does he stay loyal to his friend, Marcel? Does he stay loyal to his country? Does he stay loyal to Julia? What are going to be his choices? And so at this stage, remember, he's chosen to serve the public as an intellectual, to be loyal to his friend Marcel. And at this stage, this is what influences his view. And this is where we find out about what some of the big picture, although we don't know the details yet, about what Olivier had done. Right? He's able to put together to find out that Olivier had turned against Ciccani. Right? That Ciccani, with all of the political intrigues that he'd been running in the background against the Cardinal de Daux, right, to try and move the papacy out of Avignon back to Rome, right? That Olivier had turned against Ciccani, and he had ruined those plans. And Ciccani had gone from being powerful cardinal to being like a ruined man in that process. Julian connects Manlius with Olivier, and he judges Olivier very harshly for his betrayal of Cicciani. Right? And we're told towards the end that even though he's using Manlius's philosophy, it says, well, maybe if Julian had read some of these other passages from Manlius, he might have rethought his position. But he was kind of biased in his reading because he was thinking mostly about himself and his position in relation to Marcel. Right. Now we saw last time that Julia had been found by Julian and Marcel in Marseille, in the city of Marseille, second biggest city in France. And she had been in trouble, remember, she would have difficulty getting away, and Julian raises money, and they fake some documents, and she manages to get out of the country, and she leaves. Right? And so Julian is without Julia for a long time, for about a year, right? And he hopes to hear something from her, and he gets no letters, nothing. But then one day, it's raining, he's watching people come out of church, and he sees someone there coming out of the church, and he's like, I know that person. There's only one person I know that walks and has that posture, and of course it is Julia. And so he goes over to her, they embrace, and he takes her back to his place, and she tells him what happened to her in that intervening year. Julia tells him that she went to various other countries, she tried to get to America, she tried to go to various other places in Europe, and each place she was unable to get asylum. She was unable to go there as a refugee. Right? So even though America had a policy that said, oh yeah, we'll accept any refugees, they also actively were stopping people from actually coming to America and blocking them from actually getting there. Right? So if they got to America, they were safe, but the Americans were actively stopping them from actually getting to America itself. Very strange. Very similar things are happening right now in Australia. Lots of refugees try to come to Australia, but the Australian government says, yes, we'll accept any refugees, but then they block them from actually getting to Australia. Okay, so having gone to all these different places, she doesn't have anything left. She has nowhere left to go, and so she goes back to Julia, right, for her help. And if you remember, he still has, from way back, he has this house that he inherited from, I think, from his mother's side, a house at a place called Huawei. And so they decide that Julia will secretly live there, right? And that Julian will continue to do his role in Avignon, right? The big city of Avignon, relatively bigger city, and then they'll live together the rest of the time in this country house. And at the end, they accept a ride from a young German soldier, and Julia's not too impressed with Julian for doing that. Okay, then Julia moves into that house, and she discovers the shrine of Saint Sophia, and she also sees what remains of Luca Pisano's paintings, remembering that at this stage in the story, no one remembers who Luca Pisano is. He doesn't become one of the famous Renaissance painters like Giotto or Pietro Lorenzetti or any of those guys. Instead, he's forgotten, even though he's supposed to be this groundbreaking painter. And in turn, seeing these paintings, she's inspired to continue her own painting. Right? We then see that she meets some of the local people, including Pierre Duvaux, right, who is a blacksmith there, and she works with him on creating printing presses and stuff, and in turn, draws pictures of him and stuff. And this guy, Pierre Duvaux, if you remember back earlier earlier in the novel, Julian had an affair with a woman from this place named Elisabeth, right? Just a very brief affair. She was in love with him, but he wasn't really in love with her. It was just a sort of physical attachment, and that's her husband, Pierre Duveau. Right? We see that Julia's own work as an artist, she hasn't been able to sell anything because she's Jewish, and so there's a discrimination against her. We then jump back to the Manlius story, right? And we see that Manlius and Felix are pursuing two different strategies. Manlius is going off as the bishop, representing the other bishops, to go and make the treaty with King Gundobad, right? Remember, he's the barbarian king to the sort of the northeast, right? Whereas King Uric is from the west and the north into the west, and Uric is, rather, Felix is going to try and raise an army to fight off Uric, like the other bishops had proposed, but Manlius thinks this is going to be a failure, right? He thinks that's a hopeless path, and he's going off to seek Gundobad. Right. Then we see Manlius. He rides towards the Burgundian encampment. He's not actually on the donkey all the way, but he does bring a donkey with him because this is a traditional symbol of both humility and of peace, right? So if you came riding on a horse that said, I'm arrogant, I'm ready to fight, and come on, take me on. Whereas if you came on riding on a donkey, right, that said, I'm here to talk, I'm not here to fight, I'm humble, I'm a nice guy, come make a deal with me. Right? So you might remember that Jesus himself does this on Palm Sunday, right, when he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey in the Bible. And we also see that he sends his son, Syagrius, he sends him on ahead to see what the mood is like in the Burgundian camp. Right? Remembering Syagrius was his adopted son, right? Remember that Manlius he adopts Syagrius after he's unable to have children of his own, and he's kind of disappointed in Syagrius because he picked him because he was like, oh, this guy he's handsome, he seems like he's a sort of robust young man, but then it turns out after he adopts him, he's like, and he's kind of dumb. Right? He's kind of not that smart, so he's disappointed in him. He notices some rotting fruit in the orchard, and this leads Manlius into the description of our first real description of the dream of Scipio, his manuscript, right? In which he argues that the righteous man acts from virtue without worrying about success, and that he uses his reason to try and make reality reflect the divine, right? Then we get it, and I've tried to distill as much as I can into a short passage because it's quite a complicated summary of the contents and the main argument of the dream of Scipio. So we see he gives us a broad overview of this text, and we see that it's inspired by, but it is markedly different to the dream of Scipio. Remember that Cicero's dream of Scipio, the dream is by the younger Scipio, right, the hero of the Republic, and in the dream he meets his dead adopted grandfather. His adopted grandfather takes him up into the heavens, and they look down on the earth, right, and the adopted grandfather, Scipio Africanus, tells him, you've got to do your duty, right? You've got to be a good citizen. You've got to go and, fight for your country and do your duty, right? In this one, though, we see that the dream is not had by Scipio, but it is Manlius's dream about Scipio, and he talks in the prologue with Sophia, who appears in the dialogue as well, right, about the destruction of Carthage. Carthage is a famous city in North Africa, right? So if you think of, of Rome, right? Rome, then like Italy, faces into the Mediterranean Sea. So if you just sailed straight across the seas, right, you'd be in North Africa, right? So one of Rome's biggest rivals was a city across the Mediterranean Sea in North Africa called Carthage, and they fought many wars against each other, the most famous being against a general called Hannibal, right? And the Carthaginians were pretty tough and scary. They had elephants instead of just horses, right? All sorts of stuff like that. And eventually Rome destroyed Carthage. And when they destroyed Carthage, they didn't just knock down a few walls and kill a few people. They completely destroyed Carthage, and they tried to make sure that Carthage would never, ever, ever rise again. And the famous thing that they did in order to achieve this is that they took salt, right? And all of the wheat fields and all the fields that the Carthaginians used to produce their food, they plowed the salt into the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Right? So this land was just so salty that it couldn't produce any crops. So no one could live there, and so Carthage was just obliterated. Right? And for the future would be obliterated too. So he talks about this destruction of Carthage with Sophia, and we're told that this same passage, the same description of the destruction of Carthage is also the starting point for St. Augustine, right? Remember, who's living just a little bit before Manlius, right? A few decades before Manlius. So it provides us a similar point, but remembering that Manlius sees himself as non-Christian. St. Augustine, by contrast, sees himself as an advocate for Christianity, but both are writing about this sort of end of civilization as they see it, right? This destruction that's happening in their time. Okay, so the narrator then says to us this is important because he thinks that Manlius had read St. Augustine and was responding in many ways to the same ideas and also to St. Augustine's text. We then see some of the central arguments of Manlius's text, which he says that humans, he says, cannot be virtuous. Right? Now, this is a counterpoint to a lot of the Greek philosophy that Manlius has learned from his own education. Right? So if we think, for example, of a text that we've referenced a few times with regard to friendship, and that is Aristotle's Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, right? Remembering that the best kind of friendship was grounded in what? In virtue, right? In someone being a good person, right? That's the kind of person you want to be friends with, Aristotle says. And earlier in the book on ethics, Aristotle talks about how it's important to learn to be virtuous, right? That's it. It's his central premise, I told you, is that all human beings want to be happy. How do you get to be happy? Well, he considers different options. You could be wealthy, you could be famous, you could be powerful, you could have lots of lovers, whatever it is. But then he decides that the longest lasting, the most satisfying, the real kind is one that's obtained by being virtuous, right? By being a good person. Right? That'll be its own reward, argues Aristotle, and it will last. Right? And so, central to that, obviously, is the idea that human beings can learn to be virtuous, to be good. Right? Whereas we see here Manlius is being skeptical of this idea. Right? His argument, his debate that he has with Sophia is that, well, humans, they're kind of too stupid, or he says in the dialogue, humans seem to be too stupid. They don't care enough about philosophy. They don't care enough about their lives to make themselves virtuous. Right? And Sophia sort of softens it. She says, well, they're not too stupid. She says, oh, they're too scared. Right? They're worried about their lives. So what you need to do is you need to be their leader, says Sophia, not in real life. Remember, this is Sophia in the dialogue, in the Dream of Scipio. And Sophia tells him in the dialogue, right, you need to take charge, right? If people aren't able to be rational, they're not able to find happiness or virtue for themselves, you've got to step in and make it happen. Right? So we see here a rational man a sort of philosopher king. And something happened here to my PowerPoint. Okay, anyway. A rational man would step in and would take over and make these things happen, right? And we start to see that, like, the style of thinking that Sophia has taught Manlius, in which she always goes through by a Socratic method of question and answer, of logic. We start to see that Manlius abandons this style and he just kind of starts preaching in this part. Okay, I think I accidentally deleted a slide. Yes, I did. Okay, so let me just go to the... All right, so we see, we then go back to Julia, and Julia has a conversation with Elisabeth, right? Yeah, what just happened? Yeah, something has happened to this. Okay. Yes, Julia has a conversation with Elisabeth, and Elisabeth obviously is kind of jealous of Julia, right? And she tells Julia, "Oh yeah, many years ago I came here and I was wondering what I should do. Should I get married to this guy that I did marry? And I prayed to Saint Sophia, and she told me that I should marry this guy Pierre, and she was wrong. I don't like him. I'm not happy in my marriage." And then we see that she leaves behind some food for Julia. Okay, and we see that Julia continues to lead this double life. Some of his time at Avignon, being a public intellectual, the rest of his time with Julia in the countryside, and Marcel becomes more powerful but also more difficult to deal with. We see that Julia helps Julien with some of his research, right? She tells him, like, maybe you're not doing the right thing here with your helping Marcel and playing this public role, right? She says, is that really what, like, these ideas that you're dealing with, like from Manlius and so on, is that really what you should be doing, right? And remembering that we've seen already that this friendship between Julien and Julia enables them to criticize each other constructively, right? It enables them to tell each other honestly things that, you know, they need to hear, even though they might be difficult things. So we saw earlier in the novel that Julien is able to criticize Julia's paintings, right, in a way that, you know, is honest, but is difficult for her to hear, but nonetheless that she needs to hear. And here, Julia does the same thing, and she also, she also helps him work out that she sees some pictures of Isabelle de Fréjus, right? Some old because of the old paintings that she's been looking at, and she says, Olivier in his poetry calls this woman a woman of darkness. She's like, that doesn't make any sense. Look at her. She's not a woman of darkness, right? She's blonde. You know, why would he call her a woman of darkness? So they figure out, oh, maybe there's someone else. Maybe there's someone different that he's talking about. And then we also see that Julia's paintings that she's been doing, that she shows to Julien from the Shrine of Saint Sophia, shows that she has finally found her own style and her own voice as an artist. And then we close with Marcel visiting Julien in Avignon, and he sees some of Julia's new paintings, right? He kind of makes fun of them, And he says, "Oh, glad to see that. Did that Julia girl? Did she get out of here? Did she leave? Did she leave France?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, she's gone. Yeah. Oh, good to hear. Good to hear." And that's where we leave off for our reading summary. Okay. Now, I want to. One of our things that we've looked at so far, one of the themes that we've seen repeatedly, is the way in which things, as they go down to us through history, or as they change through history, become easily misunderstood or misread by later people, later generations, later historians, or in other cases, they even become forgotten entirely, right? So we saw, for instance, with the story of Olivier, right, that his story, the one that's unfolded for us that we've seen with Gersonides and Rebecca and all that sort of stuff, is not even in the official history of his life, right? All that history that we got in the first few pages turns out to be mostly wrong, right? Turns out to be mostly wrong. Other figures, like Luca Pisano, for example, forgotten. No one even knows who he is anymore. No one even knows who painted the paintings in the Shrine of St. Sophia, and we see that it's also fallen into ruin itself. Right? So there are numerous ways in which we've seen misreadings and misrepresentations. Sometimes it's by accident. Sometimes it's because historical things change. Sometimes it's because there are like stories and myths like around Sophia that turn her into Saint Sophia, right? All these things intervene in the way in which history works, in the way in which we remember and understand things. Even those people who are trying very hard to understand something on its own terms, such as those philosophers who are trying to read and understand, let's say, someone like Plato, right? Even they end up transforming his ideas into a new kind of philosophy that we've seen is called Neoplatonism. They weren't trying to turn it into something different. They thought they were really reading Plato as he was meant to be read. But because they come to it with their own ideas, their own prejudices, their own influences that sometimes they're not even aware of, right? That they still transform his ideas as well. Now, sometimes though we can see, and these next two examples are examples of this, is that sometimes that process can also be rather more deliberate, right? That process of historical distortion, right? So a building burning down and us losing a famous text or an important text, that's an accident, right? Or someone's reputation falling into disrepair because they're just simply forgotten about, or a book being lost, whatever it is. Those we've seen are historical accidents. But in other cases, we see history and ideas being rewritten, reinterpreted deliberately in a distorted manner. And so I'm going to give you two examples of this now. The first one is of Julian, right, and his understanding of Olivier, right? And we've seen that so far, Julian's knowledge of Olivier has been more impressive than any of the other historians and scholars who have studied before him, right? He's been able to discover more things about Olivier's past and what happened to him than anyone else has, right? He's seen like the conspiracies with Chichani, and like remember he finds out about like the banking details that someone passes on to him. He's able to find the connections between Olivier and Manlius that no one else had noticed before. He's able to work out that Isabelle de Fréjus was not Olivier's lover, right? That it was someone else. So he's able to discover all of these new things about Olivier and to gain this knowledge. Of course, our knowledge from reading the novel will be greater, but he's able to discover all these things about Olivier. And yet, when he comes to write his essay on Olivier, right, he finds it very difficult to separate the experiences that he is having during World War II and his own emotional needs and his own trying to justify his own position in helping Marcel, and how he reads and understands what is happening with Olivier. Right. So if you remember when we're told about Julien's death, that he not only burns like himself, kills himself in the fire, but he also burns everything around him. So including, we imagine, this essay as well. Okay. So let's look at the way in which he rather dishonestly approaches this question of how he interprets Olivier. So we see, and so Julien judged Olivier de Noyon harshly and without pity. Right? He's like, this Olivier guy, right? He doesn't deserve any pity, right? He's a traitor. He did the wrong thing. Therefore, history should judge him harshly. He even referred back to Manlius and the example he set, using the text of the dream of Scipio as the link. Right? So he's connecting here. He's, as we've seen earlier, he's discovered that Olivier's poetry contains references back to Manlius, and he's established this connection between the two of them through that, and now he's using that link to compare them. For Olivier knew Manlius' words, but had utterly failed to comprehend them, it seemed. Then he quotes here from Manlius. No one can possess wisdom if consumed by intemperance. Right? So intemperance, what does this mean? Temperance? Sometimes it can mean be a synonym for being drunk, but it's not what it actually means here. Right? It doesn't mean that he was drunk. But rather, think about like the golden mean that is one of the central ideas of Aristotle and of Greek philosophy. Right? And for the Greeks, and particularly for Aristotle, this idea of the golden mean was that you didn't want too much of something. Right? So let's think about it in terms of food, right? If you eat too much, you're a glutton, you're going to get fat, you're going to have health problems, right? You don't want too much, right? That is intemperate, to eat too much. It's also intemperate to starve yourself. That's also not good for your health. It's not good for you to eat too little, right? So the idea of the golden mean is to find that temperate point, right? The balance in between, right? So basically here, like intemperate means like a sort of unbalanced way of looking at the world, unbalanced or over-the-top way of behaving. Right? That's what it means. So basically, Manlius is saying, and here he's repeating an old idea from the Greeks, from Aristotle, right? You can't be wise, right, if you're all over the place, right? You've got to have a sense of balance first, and then that's going to allow you to have wisdom. Right? So, no one can possess wisdom if consumed by intemperance, says Manlius, quoting the Protagoras, right, which is a dialogue by Plato. So this is where his source is from. Yet Olivier's actions were surely intemperate, were unbalanced. This is according to Julien's interpretation, of course. Another statement, this time derived from Cicero, also gave him comfort. For the wisest of all Romans stated that, quote, you cannot act rightly by taking up arms against your father or your fatherland. Right? You cannot act rightly by taking up arms against your father or your fatherland. So remembering that this is what Julien is struggling with, right? If he steps down from his position, he is essentially saying, like, I'm going against my country, is how he views it, right? And he doesn't want to do that. Okay, so then he says, was that not what Olivier had done? For in that age without countries, right? Remembering we saw that like the countries we know don't exist during Olivier's or Manlius's time. Remember, they're just much smaller states at this time. For that age without countries, Cardinal Ciccani was both father and fatherland, obviously not literally his father, but a father figure, to Olivier. And he had turned against both. Julian's own position was the more clear, surely. Had Julian been less influenced by his own predicament, then he might have looked harder and guessed the poet's motivations earlier than he did. He might have considered the possibility that Manlius, in writing these words, was passing a verdict on his own acts rather than providing a philosophical basis for them. Right? So we see here that Julian's perspective on Olivier, his interpretation of him in this essay, is very biased. Right? He judges Olivier to be a traitor, as to someone who should not be pitied, right? Whom we should not have any sympathy for. He betrayed Ciccani. He did the wrong thing. End of the case, as far as Julian is concerned. Right? He went against the philosophy that he was following from Manlius. He went against the rules of his time. He went against the conventions. He was a traitor, and therefore we should have no sympathy for him. And that's Julian's position, right? And as we see, its designed, hidden motivation is, or its ulterior motive, as we call it, is that he's trying to justify his own collaboration with Marcel. Right? He's trying to say, oh, well, I don't want to be a traitor. Right? I don't want to be like Olivier. Right? So this is what he's doing. However, as we see at the end of that quotation, we see that the narrator tells us that if he had looked a little more carefully at Manlius, if he'd known a little bit more about Manlius, then he might have rethought what was going to happen, right, and what he was doing. Right? Because as we'll see, Manlius ends up with some pretty tricky situations to resolve and some difficult decisions to make. Okay, now the second of these quotations is from the section describing the dream of Scipio. Right. It's on page 151 in your course book. And this is where we see Manlius, whom we've seen has been so, like early in our book, right, in the first few pages, has been so much an admirer of the classic Greek and Roman writers. And yet, what we see in the Dream of Scipio is that he takes their ideas, and we've already seen this a little bit with the way in which he reworks the idea of virtue from Aristotle and Plato, right? And he reuses them in a way that justifies his own position, his own actions. Right? So we're told that the way in which he says these things about virtue, this is the remarkable sentence is the one about virtue, where he overturns the relationship between virtue and education. It says, a remarkable sentence which struck Julien when he read it, for Manlius completely overturns orthodoxy. In other words, he overturns what everyone else had been saying amongst the Greek and Romans, whether Platonic or Christian. Right? And then he summarizes what Manlius is saying. He says that Manlius's position is that the point of civilization is to be civilized, the purpose of action is to perpetuate society, for only in society can philosophy truly take place. Only a man who realized civilization might not continue could have reformulated classical ideas in such a way. Only a man contemplating drastic action could have penned such a self-justification. Only with such an aim could the pagan pretend to be a Christian and the friend abandon his friends. So we see here, we're told that beneath the surface of these ideas that we see in Manlius's Dream of Scipio. We're seeing that he is justifying his own earlier actions that we haven't yet had described for us yet, that we don't know what he's done. But we know that it must be bad. It must have been drastic. It must have been something that he has done that he is really worried about and that he is having to write in order to justify himself. As a piece of philosophy, it was not of the highest order, right? In other words, like, this is not a great bit of philosophy. Manlius abandoned the syllogistic form, which is a kind of logic that was invented by the Greeks and used by the Greeks to prove things, and scarcely argues at all. Through the mouth of Sophia, he instructs merely. Is this how Sophia taught? Did she just tell people, this is how to think? I believe this. This is how you should look at things. How did she? Right? She asked questions, right? She had discussions, dialogues, logical debates, right? But notice that Manlius still uses her as his mouthpiece, right? As the person who is supposedly speaking for him in this dialogue. But his version of Sophia is not the same Sophia that we've seen as Manlius's real-life friend. Right? Instead, she just is this hollowed-out mouthpiece who just tells people to do things, instructs them in ways of thinking instead of, as she had done in real life, had debated with them, argued with them, discussed with them. Right? Okay. And so we start to see that there's some sort of tension going on here between what Manlius really wants, which is a society that is grounded in philosophy, right? That is able to debate and talk and have intelligent arguments, and yet the very thing that he does with this philosophy is that he no longer actually does those very things. In order to protect philosophy, in order to protect this dialogue, he actually has to go against its very principles of discussion, dialogue, logic, and instead becomes authoritarian. Okay. So in these two examples, we can see there are these new, or not very new, but these two different ways of self-justification which distorts the history, right? Distorts the reality of the way in which these things are seen in another way that adds to the other kinds of historical distortion that we've seen that occurs in the novel, right? Some of them are by accident. Many of them we've seen have been by accident, by fires and plagues and floods and just things being lost and all sorts of things like that. But here we have people also actively trying to change history, trying to change the way in which they're perceived, trying to change the way in which they are seen by others in the course of history. Okay, so I want to sort of end this part of the discussion before we move on to our homework sheets with this question that's really going to haunt the rest of this novel, if it hasn't already been there in the background so far of what we've read. And it's a question that particularly pertains, obviously, to Manlius, but really with all three of our main protagonists, all three of our main characters. And it's this question about which one matters more? Which is more important? Is it more important to be good, to be a good person, to be virtuous, right? Is it more important to be virtuous than to be good? Or is it more important to be successful, to get what you want, to achieve your aims, right? And we're going to see, as I've mentioned many times before, increasingly our characters are drawn into situations where they have to make very difficult, lose-lose, tough choices, right? And not only do they have to choose very often between their public duty and their private loves and friendships like we see in the Raphael painting, but they also have to choose between these different things. Is it better to be a good person and fail? Is that okay? Is it okay to be a bad person but succeed? Which one matters more? Right? So think about this in the context of this last quote that I have for today, which is from the dialogue, right, the imaginary dialogue, not the actual dialogue between Sophia and Manlius, but his imaginary dialogue with her in the dream of Scipio. He says, "How is the ascent made? Must one learn virtue?" Here she laughs. "You have read too much and learned too little. Virtue is a road, not a destination. Man cannot be virtuous. Understanding is the goal. When that is achieved, the soul can take wing." And so on. At every level, the Bishop of Vaison, Saint Manlius, launches attack after attack on Christianity, contradicting it at every turn. The soul is general, not individual. Eternal, not specific in time. The body is a prison, not something that is meriting resurrection. Faith is corruption. Hope is deception. Charity, illusion, all must be surpassed. But how must we live, Manlius asks. If man cannot be virtuous, can there be no good man? Action is the activity of the rational soul, which abhors irrationality and must combat it or be corrupted by it. When it sees the irrationality of others, it must seek to correct it, and do this either by teaching or engaging in public affairs itself, correcting through its practice. And the purpose of action is to enable philosophy to continue, for if men are reduced to the material alone, they become no more than beasts. So as I said, this passage and what the rest of the novel in particular, the choices that we see our characters make, is that they have to make these choices. Is it better to be a good person, to be someone who is virtuous and risk failing, right? Risk not getting what you want. And we already saw that, like, for example, Manlius's father had done this, right? Remember, Manlius's father had gone and he had fought against the barbarians and he had died in the process, right? And so Manlius already has an example of someone who had been virtuous, good person, had done what he was supposed to, followed his duty, been good, and yet what had his father's death achieved? Nothing, as far as Manlius is concerned. Because he had fought against the barbarians, he'd been good, he'd done what he'd supposed to, and yet they're still being attacked by barbarians. They're still under threat. They still have, that problem still hasn't gone away, right? So, is that okay? Is it okay to be virtuous but fail? Or is it better maybe to be a bad guy, to do terrible things, or to make allies, say, with barbarians who are cruel and murderous, and that you might step on a few toes and other things along the way. But if you can end the barbarian threat, and you can save your people, and you can bring political stability to the area, and you can stop the barbarian invasions, you've been a bad guy, but you've achieved your end. Is that better? Is that okay? So those are the kinds of difficult questions we will have to ask ourselves and about these characters as we go forward. Virtue, successful outcome. Is it even possible to have both? Okay, we're out of time, so thank you guys, and I'll see you next Monday as we come towards the end of our book.